No one believed the warnings until the sky turned the color of bruised iron. When the grid collapsed and the glass mansions of Pinecrest Ridge began to freeze from the inside out, the town's wealthiest residents realized their millions couldn't buy warmth, but the man they ridiculed could. Arthur Pendleton was a man who understood the unforgiving nature of weight and gravity. For 12 years, he had been one of the most sought-after structural engineers in Colorado. That was before his wife Claire was diagnosed with aggressive stage 4 lymphoma. The American medical system had exacted a heavy toll, stripping Arthur of his savings, his business, and eventually his 4-bedroom suburban home. Despite spending every dime he had, Claire passed away on a rainy Tuesday, leaving Arthur alone to raise their 7-year-old daughter Chloe. Bankrupt and grieving, Arthur took whatever work he could find to keep food on the table. That was how he ended up in Pinecrest Ridge, an ultra-exclusive high-altitude gated community nestled in the Rocky Mountains. The residents were venture capitalists, tech executives, and hedge fund managers who built sprawling, multi-million-dollar modern monstrosities, featuring flat roofs and floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Arthur had been hired by Gregory Hayes, a ruthless real estate developer, to reinforce a failing retaining wall on Hayes's 8-acre estate. It was a massive, dangerous job that took Arthur 3 months of back-breaking labor. But when the time came to pay the $45,000 invoice, Gregory simply refused. "The aesthetic is wrong, Arthur," Gregory had said, sipping an espresso on his heated patio while Arthur stood in mud-caked boots. "I'm not paying $45,000 for concrete that looks like a prison wall. Take me to court if you want. My lawyers will drag it out until your daughter is in college." Arthur couldn't afford a lawyer, let alone groceries for the month. Knowing Arthur was desperate, Gregory offered a cruel settlement. At the very edge of the Pinecrest Ridge, development sat Lot 42, a completely unbuildable vertical slice of limestone cliff that Gregory had acquired by mistake in a larger land grab. Its only feature was a deep, abandoned 19th-century silver mining adit. It was a hole in the ground. "I'll sign the deed to Lot 42 over to you." Gregory had smirked, handing Arthur the paperwork in front of a group of his wealthy neighbors who chuckled into their expensive coats. "Consider the debt settled. You can live in the cave, Arthur. It suits your current budget." With eviction looming over his head, Arthur swallowed his pride, signed the papers, and took the deed. The community of Pinecrest Ridge treated it as the joke of the decade. They dubbed Arthur the Caveman. When Arthur drove his rusted 1998 Ford pickup through the immaculate neighborhood gates, mothers would pull their children back from the pristine sidewalks. Gregory Hayes made it a point to drive his Mercedes G-Wagon slowly past the cliff face, pointing and laughing with his wife Cynthia. But Arthur wasn't laughing. He was an engineer, and he saw what the arrogant billionaires didn't. The cave was deep, structurally sound, and naturally insulated by thousands of tons of solid limestone. With nowhere else to go, Arthur and Chloe moved in. Using salvaged materials, scrap metal, and his bare hands, Arthur spent the summer and fall transforming the dark void into a fortress of survival. He framed out the interior, pouring a leveling concrete floor. He installed a heavy surplus steel naval door he bought from a scrapyard for $50. Most importantly, he built an ingenious heating system, a high-efficiency cast-iron wood stove that vented its smoke safely through a natural fissure in the rock, pulling fresh oxygen from a separate hidden intake pipe. He lined the walls with reflective insulation and built a cozy timber-framed loft for Chloe, complete with battery-powered fairy lights to chase away the dark. He rigged solar panels on the cliff's southern exposure, connecting them to a bank of deep-cycle marine batteries that powered a water filtration system, drawing from a subterranean spring at the back of the mine. While Gregory Hayes spent $100,000 importing Italian marble for his foyer, Arthur spent $300 on bulk rice, dried beans, canned goods, and medical supplies, storing them in the naturally refrigerated depths of the cavern. The mockery only intensified as winter approached. The HOA, led by Gregory, tried repeatedly to evict Arthur, citing bylaws against unauthorized subterranean dwellings. But Arthur had outsmarted them. He had legally registered the plot as an agricultural root cellar with a temporary wilderness camping permit. There was nothing they could do but sneer. "Daddy, why do they hate us?" Chloe asked one evening in late October, clutching her stuffed rabbit as they heard the distant mocking honk of Gregory's SUV on the road below. Arthur stoked the fire, the warm orange light dancing across the stone walls of their home. He sat beside his daughter and pulled a thick wool blanket over her shoulders. "They don't hate us." "Sweetheart," Arthur said quietly, his eyes dark with a quiet, weary wisdom. "They're just completely disconnected from reality. They think money can negotiate with nature, but winter is coming and nature doesn't take bribes." The meteorological anomaly began forming over the Pacific in early November, a massive atmospheric river that collided violently with a freak Arctic polar vortex dropping down from Canada. The National Weather Service issued a code black alert, a warning reserved for historic life-threatening weather events. They predicted a bomb cyclone that would stall directly over the Rocky Mountains, dropping unheard-of amounts of snow in a matter of hours. In Pinecrest Ridge, the warnings were treated as an inconvenience rather than a threat. These were people who believed their wealth made them invincible. Their homes were smart, controlled by iPads and powered by the grid. When the local authorities urged mandatory evacuations for high-altitude communities, Gregory Hayes actually laughed on a local news broadcast. "We have backup generators and $5 million homes," Gregory boasted to the camera. "We're not running from a little snow. In fact, we're hosting our annual winter solstice gala tonight. It's going to be beautiful." Down in the limestone cliff, Arthur was not laughing. He recognized the terrifying plunge in barometric pressure. The air outside felt heavy metallic and unnaturally still. He spent the entire day chopping extra cordwood, stacking it high against the interior walls of the cave. He checked the seals on the steel door, topped off his battery banks, and pulled Chloe's winter gear from storage. The storm did not arrive gently. It hit at 8:15 p.m. like a freight train of white violence. The wind screamed through the valley at 80 miles per hour, carrying snow so dense it was impossible to see past the end of an outstretched arm. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees to a bone-cracking 25 below zero in less than 40 minutes. Up at the Hayes estate, the winter gala was in full swing. 70 of Pinecrest Ridge's wealthiest residents were drinking champagne in tuxedos and evening gowns, marveling at the blizzard raging outside the massive glass walls of Gregory's living room. At 10:22 p.m., the regional power grid catastrophically failed. High-voltage transmission towers, burdened by tons of ice and battered by hurricane-force winds, snapped like dry twigs. The Hayes mansion plunged into darkness. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Seconds later, Gregory's massive diesel backup generator roared to life, restoring the lights. Gregory raised his glass to cheers. "Nothing to worry about, folks. The party continues." But Gregory didn't understand physics. He hadn't bothered to winterize the generator or add anti-gel additives to the diesel fuel. At 30 degrees below zero, untreated diesel thickens into a useless, waxy sludge. At 1:14 a.m., the generator sputtered, coughed, and died. The lights went out again. This time they did not come back on. The smart thermostats died. The heated floors went cold. Within an hour, the reality of their architectural hubris set in. Gregory's house was a masterpiece of modern design, which meant it was entirely made of glass and steel materials that offer practically zero thermal resistance. Without the massive HVAC system pumping continuous heat, the mansion immediately began to bleed warmth into the lethal blizzard outside. By 3 a.m., the temperature inside the Hayes mansion had dropped to 38 degrees and was still falling rapidly. The 70 guests dressed in thin silk dresses and tailored suits began to shiver violently. Panic set in. Cell service had been wiped out by the storm. There was no way to call for a rescue helicopter or snowplows. Then came the structural failures. Modern flat roofs are not designed to hold the weight of rapidly accumulating moisture-heavy snow. By 4 a.m., nearly 5 feet of snow had already fallen. A horrific groaning crack echoed above the grand ballroom. The ceiling bowed inward. "We need to get to the basement," someone screamed. But Gregory's house didn't have a basement. It was built on a sleek concrete slab. Suddenly, a loud crack like a gunshot shattered the air. The thermal shock of the freezing interior, clashing with the residual heat of the house, caused one of the massive 20-foot floor-to-ceiling windows to completely shatter. A howling vortex of -30-degree wind and blinding snow violently invaded the living room. The guests screamed, scrambling backward as the blizzard literally swallowed the house. Frostbite could set in on exposed skin in less than 10 minutes in these conditions. They were trapped, isolated, and rapidly freezing to death inside a $5 million icebox. 2 miles down the ridge, buried beneath the earth, the world was entirely different. Inside the cave, it was a comfortable 68 degrees. The millions of tons of limestone surrounding them acted as a perfect thermal mass, trapping the heat radiating from the cast-iron stove. The heavy steel door was sealed tight against the howling wind, reducing the apocalyptic storm outside to a faint, muffled hum. Chloe was fast asleep in her loft, tucked under 2 heavy quilts, clutching her rabbit. Arthur sat by the fire, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hands, reading a worn paperback by the light of a single LED lantern. He occasionally tossed another log into the stove, listening to the satisfying crackle of dry wood. He had enough food, water, and firewood to last 3 months. Back in the shattered ruins of the Hayes mansion, Gregory watched in horror as his wife, Cynthia, fell to the floor, her lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. Her breathing was shallow. Hypothermia was taking her. Around them, millionaires were sobbing, huddling together under decorative silk throws that offered zero protection. "Think!" a tech CEO yelled over the roaring wind, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Who has a fireplace? Who has wood?" "Nobody!" another panicked voice cried out. "Our fireplaces are all decorative gas inserts. The gas lines are frozen." Gregory stared out the shattered window into the deadly white void. 8 feet of snow was projected by morning. Nobody was coming for them. The National Guard couldn't even get vehicles up the mountain in this. They would all be dead by sunrise. Then a memory pierced through Gregory's panic. A memory of a man he had mocked. A man he had forced into a hole in the ground. "You can live in the cave, Arthur." A cave. Underground. Thermally insulated. With a wood-burning stove and a heavy steel door, Gregory turned to the shivering, weeping crowd. His voice was raw with desperation and the bitter taste of a pride he was about to swallow whole. "Pendleton." Gregory whispered, though the wind snatched the name away. He yelled louder. "Pendleton the contractor. He lives in the old mining cave at the bottom of Lot 42. The guests stared at him, their faces pale masks of terror and freezing sweat. "It's a mile away," Gregory yelled, pulling a heavy fur coat off a coat rack and wrapping it around his dying wife. "It's downhill. If we link arms and follow the tree line, we can make it. It's the only place on this mountain with a fire. We have to go to the cave." Leaving the shattered ruins of the Hayes mansion was a descent into an icy hell. Of the 70 guests who had toasted to their invincible wealth just hours before, only 42 found the courage or the sheer desperate panic to follow Gregory out into the screaming white void. The others, paralyzed by fear or already succumbing to the lethal lethargy of hypothermia, refused to leave the dark, freezing corners of the grand ballroom. They simply curled into fetal positions on the imported Italian rugs, hoping against all scientific reality that morning would bring a miraculous thaw. For Gregory and the group that followed him, the 1-mile trek down to Lot 42 was a brutal education in human frailty. The wind was a physical barrier, shoving them backward with hurricane-force gusts. The snow was already waist-deep and rising, forcing the men to take turns breaking the trail. They were a pathetic, tragic procession. Venture capitalists in bespoke Tom Ford suits, and women in sheer Vera Wang evening gowns, wrapped in whatever scraps of fabric they could scavenge. Tablecloths, velvet curtains, decorative throws plunged into the -30-degree blizzard. Every step was an agonizing battle against gravity and the elements. Expensive leather loafers and high heels were immediately lost in the snowdrifts, leaving them to walk in stockinged feet that quickly grew numb, then painfully blocky with frostbite. "Keep moving," Gregory roared his voice, barely a croak against the deafening howl of the storm. He was carrying his wife Cynthia over his shoulder. She had stopped shivering 20 minutes ago, a terrifying medical milestone, indicating her body was running out of the energy required to generate heat. Behind him, Richard, a billionaire hedge fund manager who had famously shorted medical supply companies during a national shortage, fell to his knees. "I can't." Richard sobbed, his face crusted in ice snot, frozen to his upper lip. "My legs are dead. I can't feel my legs." "Get up, Richard," yelled Harrison, a Silicon Valley tech magnate, grabbing the man by the lapels of his frozen tuxedo jacket. But Harrison's hands were too numb to grip, and he slipped tumbling into a massive drift. It took them 2 excruciating hours to cover 3/4 of a mile. By the time they reached the tree line bordering the jagged limestone cliffs of Lot 42, the snow was chest-high. They were crawling. Dignity had been stripped away by the sheer animalistic drive to survive. They were crying, praying, and bleeding, dragging themselves through the powder like wounded insects. Then, through the blinding, swirling darkness, Gregory saw it. It wasn't a light Arthur had engineered the cave to be totally blacked out from the outside to preserve heat, but rather a faint, steady stream of grey smoke venting from a narrow fissure high up on the rock face. The sweet, unmistakable scent of burning cedar caught the wind. Fire. "There!" Gregory screamed, tears instantly freezing on his cheeks. "The cave! He's in the cave!" Driven by a final surge of adrenaline, the surviving group bulldozed through the remaining snowdrifts, tumbling down the embankment until they hit the sheer rock wall. They crawled along the icy limestone until Gregory's frozen, bloody hands met cold, solid steel. It was the navel door. Gregory began to pound on the heavy metal with his fists. When his knuckles went numb, he used a loose rock, striking the steel with desperate, rhythmic thuds. "Pendleton Arthur, please." Gregory screamed, his voice cracking the wind, snatching the words from his throat. Inside the cavern, the muffled metallic clanking echoed through the warm, fire-lit space. Arthur, who had been dozing in a rocking chair near the wood stove, sat up instantly. He reached for a heavy iron fire poker, his protective instincts flaring. "Daddy," Chloe murmured from the loft, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. What is that noise? Is it a bear? Stay in bed, Chloe. Pull the quilt up, Arthur commanded softly. He walked toward the heavy steel door, feeling the icy, radiating chill coming off the metal. He unlatched the heavy brass peephole cover. Through the thick, distorted glass, Arthur saw a nightmare. It was a tangled mass of half-dead, freezing humanity. Faces were blue and white with severe frostbite. Eyes were wide with primal terror. And front and center, holding the limp body of his wife, was Gregory Hayes, the man who had laughed at his wife's medical debt, the man who had banished him to this hole in the ground. I could leave it locked, a dark, bitter voice whispered in Arthur's mind. They mocked you. They threw you away. They represent every broken, greedy system that destroyed your life. Leaving the door locked is justice. Arthur rested his forehead against the cold steel. He looked back at the warm fire and then at his daughter who was watching him with wide, innocent eyes. If he let them die on his doorstep, he would survive, but he would become exactly like the monsters freezing outside. Arthur grabbed the heavy steel latch and pulled. The heavy naval door groaned open, fighting the immense pressure of the wind. Immediately, a violent vortex of snow and freezing air blasted into the cavern, but it was met by a wall of radiant, life-saving heat. Gregory fell across the threshold, dropping Cynthia onto the concrete floor. The others surged forward like a tide of desperate refugees, clawing and pushing their way into the warmth. They collapsed onto the stone floor, weeping uncontrollably as the 68-degree air washed over their frozen bodies. "Get inside, move to the back walls away from the door," Arthur barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Once the last shivering billionaire dragged himself inside, Arthur put his shoulder against the steel door and heaved it shut, slamming the heavy deadbolts into place. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the agonizing groans of 38 people whose nerve endings were suddenly thawing. Arthur immediately went to work. He wasn't a vindictive man. He was an engineer, and right now the problem to solve was mass hypothermia. "Strip off the wet clothes, all of you right now, or you'll die of secondary hypothermia," Arthur ordered. Harrison, the tech CEO, sat up, shivering violently in his ruined designer suit. His arrogance somehow was still intact. "Do you know who we are? We are not stripping in a filthy cave. I demand you give us blankets and your bed for the women." Arthur walked over to Harrison, his muddy boots echoing on the concrete. He stared down at the trembling billionaire, his eyes as hard as the limestone walls. "Look around you, Harrison," Arthur said quietly, his voice cutting through the moans of the crowd. "Your bank accounts are frozen. Your smart houses are shattered. Out there, your money is worth less than the snow on the ground. In here, I am the only currency that matters. You will take off the wet clothes, or I will open that door and throw you back into the storm. Your choice." Harrison stared at the heavy iron fire poker in Arthur's hand, then looked at the furious, unyielding eyes of the man he had once called the caveman. Trembling, Harrison unbuttoned his soaked jacket. For the next 10 hours, Arthur orchestrated a massive triage operation. He distributed his emergency thermal blankets and old flannel shirts. He and Chloe boiled massive pots of water, making heavily sugared black tea to raise the survivors' core temperatures. He treated Cynthia Hayes, wrapping her in his own heavy wool sleeping bag and placing her closest to the stove. By noon the next day, the storm outside had not stopped. The snow was now 8 feet deep and still falling. The realization settled over the wealthy refugees they were trapped. Gregory, wrapped in a faded moving blanket, approached Arthur, who was methodically sharpening an axe near the woodpile. "Arthur." Gregory began his voice, raspy and devoid of its usual arrogant boom. I need to thank you. You saved my wife. You saved us. When this is over, I will write you a check for $5 million. You can buy any house in Colorado." Arthur didn't look up from his whetstone. The rhythmic shk-shk of the steel filled the silence. "I don't want your money, Gregory," Arthur said evenly. $10 million. Gregory countered desperation, bleeding into his tone. He needed to re-establish the hierarchy. He needed to buy his power back. "Whatever you want, it's yours." Arthur stopped sharpening the axe. He stood up, towering over the real estate developer. "You still don't get it," Arthur said, gesturing to the cavern. "Money didn't build this. Sweat built this. Planning built this. Respect for nature built this. We are going to be trapped in this mountain for at least a week before the military can dig us out. I have enough food and wood, but maintaining enough this heat and feeding 40 people requires labor." Arthur handed the heavy steel axe to Gregory. The billionaire's arms sagged under the weight. "You want to pay your debt, Gregory? The woodpile is in the back tunnel. Start chopping. Harrison Richard, you're on water duty. Take the buckets to the subterranean spring, fill them, and boil them. Anyone who wants to eat rice and beans tonight works for it." A stunned silence fell over the room. The masters of the universe, men and women who commanded thousands of employees and controlled billions in assets, stared at the calloused hands of the single father who held their lives in the balance. For 7 agonizing, grueling days, the elite of Pinecrest Ridge lived as peasants in Arthur Pendleton's subterranean kingdom. There were no stock tickers. There were no board meetings. There was only the relentless rhythm of survival. Gregory's soft hands blistered, bled, and turned into tough calluses from swinging the axe. Harrison learned to scrub cast-iron pots with coarse salt. The wealthy women, stripped of their makeup and jewels, sat with little Chloe, teaching her how to darn socks and mend fabric to pass the time, humbled by the bright, resilient joy of a child who found warmth in a stone prison. On the 8th day, the muffled thumping sound of heavy rotors broke through the thick limestone walls. The storm had broken. National Guard Chinook helicopters had finally breached the valley. When the troops blasted their way down to Lot 42 expecting to find a mass grave, they were stunned to see the heavy steel door swing open. Out walked 38 survivors. They were filthy, smelling of wood smoke and sweat, wearing patched flannel and wrapped in moving blankets. But they were alive. As the medics rushed forward with stretchers, Gregory Hayes stopped at the threshold. He turned back to look at Arthur, who was standing in the doorway holding Chloe's hand. The massive glass mansions on the ridge above them were shattered, frozen ruins, monuments to arrogance destroyed by nature. But the cave remained entirely untouched, a fortress of true engineering. Gregory didn't offer a check this time. He didn't offer empty promises. He simply looked at the man he had tried to destroy, placed his blistered, scarred hand over his chest, and bowed his head in profound, absolute respect. 3 months later, the story of the Pinecrest Ridge blizzard made national headlines. But Arthur Pendleton refused all interviews. He didn't need the fame. He had quietly accepted a massive legal transfer of assets, a blind trust set up by 38 anonymous billionaires that ensured Chloe's college health care and future were secured forever. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't leave the mountain. Instead, Arthur bought the surrounding 50 acres of untouched forest. He expanded the cavern, installing geothermal heating and a massive underground greenhouse. He built a life that no bank could foreclose on, and no storm could shatter, living happily in the stone fortress that had forced the kings of the world to bow to the caveman. If this incredible story of karma survival and the ultimate triumph of a father's love kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear from you. Do you think Arthur made the right choice by opening that steel door? Or should he have left the billionaires in the cold? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more thrilling, true-to-life survival dramas.